At our family reunion, my uncle clinked his glass and said, "Let's all thank Nancy, the one who actually made something of herself." My mom nodded. My sister smiled. My name wasn't mentioned. So I got up, grabbed my keys, and said, "You'll all remember this in just 24 hours. I, 32M, walked out of that reunion hall with my keys in hand and my phone already buzzing. My girlfriend was calling, probably wondering why I'd left 2 hours early, but I couldn't answer yet. My hands were shaking too much, and not from fear. From rage. From years of swallowed pride finally erupting into something I couldn't contain anymore. The toast had been the final straw. Uncle Richard, the family patriarch who'd never worked a day past 50 thanks to his inheritance, had stood up with his wine glass and announced that we should all thank Nancy for being the one who actually made something of herself. Nancy, my younger sister by 3 years. The one who'd gotten her real estate license 8 months ago and sold exactly 4 houses. My mother had nodded with tears in her eyes. Nancy had smiled that practiced smile she'd perfected since high school. And me? The one who'd worked 70-hour weeks for the past decade building a company from nothing? I wasn't even mentioned. I got in my car and sat there for a moment, letting the evening air cool my face. 24 hours, I'd said. You'll all remember this in 24 hours. They'd laughed. Nancy had actually laughed, that tinkling sound she made when she thought someone was being dramatic. Uncle Richard had waved me off like I was a child throwing a tantrum. They had no idea what was coming. I'd spent the last 8 years building a software company that specialized in supply chain optimization. It wasn't glamorous. I couldn't explain it at dinner parties without people's eyes glazing over. But it was profitable. Extremely profitable. 2 months ago, I'd received an acquisition offer from a major tech corporation. The number had 7 zeros before the decimal point. I hadn't told anyone in my family because, honestly, I'd been waiting for the right moment. Some naive part of me had hoped they'd eventually notice my success on their own, that I wouldn't have to spell it out for them. But tonight had clarified everything. They didn't see me. They never had. I drove home and immediately opened my laptop. My lawyer's number was already in my recent calls from our last discussion about the acquisition deal. He answered on the second ring, clearly surprised to hear from me on a Saturday evening. I told him I wanted to accelerate everything. The papers needed to be finalized by Monday morning. He hesitated, mentioned something about due diligence timelines, but I explained that I'd pay whatever additional fees were necessary to make it happen. Money, I'd learned, could move mountains when you had enough of it. He said he'd make some calls. Next, I contacted my publicist. Yes, I had a publicist now, though I'd only hired her 3 months ago when the acquisition talks had gotten serious. She specialized in business media and had been planning a soft announcement for the following quarter. I told her the plan had changed. I wanted maximum coverage, and I wanted it Monday afternoon. She asked if I was sure, reminded me that we discussed a more gradual approach to avoid family complications. I told her the family complications were exactly the point. She understood. She'd get it done. Then I made the hardest call. My girlfriend answered immediately, asking if I was okay. I told her what had happened at the reunion, and she was silent for a long moment. She'd met my family twice before and had her own thoughts about their dynamics, but she'd always been diplomatic. Now she just asked what I needed from her. I told her I needed her to come with me tomorrow, that I was going to need someone in my corner when everything exploded. She said she'd be there. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I went through old photographs on my phone. Pictures from 10 years ago when I'd first started the company in my apartment, living on instant ramen and hope. Photos from the first time we'd landed a major client. Screenshots of revenue milestones that I'd saved but never shared. And mixed in between were family photos. Christmases where Nancy got the biggest gifts because she'd just started college. Thanksgivings where Uncle Richard held court about his business wisdom despite never building anything himself. Birthday dinners where my mother asked Nancy about her life for 45 minutes and gave me 7. The pattern had always been there. I'd just been too busy trying to prove myself to see it clearly. Sunday morning, I drafted an email. It went to my mother, my sister, Uncle Richard, and about 15 other family members who'd been at the reunion. The subject line was simple, about last night. The body was even simpler. I told them I'd be holding a press conference Monday afternoon at 2, and they were welcome to attend if they wanted to understand what I'd meant about remembering this day. I included the address of a hotel conference room downtown that my publicist had already booked. My mother called within 10 minutes. She asked what this was about, her voice carrying that edge of annoyance she got when she thought I was being difficult. I told her she'd find out tomorrow. She said I was being childish, that Uncle Richard had just been trying to celebrate Nancy's achievements. I asked her when she'd last acknowledged any of mine. She went quiet. Then she said I'd always been so sensitive, so hungry for attention. I hung up. Nancy texted an hour later. She wanted to know if I was seriously still upset about the toast, said I was overreacting, that everyone knew I had a good job. A good job. Like I was a middle manager at someone else's company. I didn't respond. Monday morning arrived with perfect weather, bright and clear. I put on my best suit, the Italian one I'd bought after closing our biggest deal last year. My girlfriend wore a navy dress and kept squeezing my hand in the car. She asked if I was sure about this, if I wouldn't regret it later. I told her the only thing I'd regret was staying silent for another decade. The publicist had done her job brilliantly. When we arrived at the hotel, there were already 3 news crews setting up. Local business reporters I recognized from television, a journalist from the major business newspaper, even a crew from a regional tech news outlet. My publicist had pitched it as a major acquisition announcement from a local success story, the kind of feel-good business content that outlets loved. My family started arriving at 1:30. My mother came first, looking confused and slightly worried. Nancy arrived with her husband, both of them dressed casually like they thought this was some kind of joke. Uncle Richard showed up in a golf shirt, actually checking his watch like I was inconveniencing him. Other aunts, uncles, and cousins filtered in, maybe a dozen in total. They clustered together in the back of the room, whispering among themselves. At exactly 2, my publicist nodded to me. The reporters were ready. The cameras were rolling. I stepped up to the small podium we'd arranged. I started by thanking everyone for coming. Then I introduced myself, gave a brief history of my company, and explained what we did in terms simple enough for the cameras. The reporters were taking notes. My family was staring, clearly still confused about what this had to do with anything. Then I announced the acquisition, the buying company's name, the deal terms that were public record, the valuation figure that made one of the reporters actually whistle softly. I explained that the deal had closed that morning, ahead of schedule, and that I was now in a position to focus on new ventures and philanthropic efforts. My mother's face had gone completely white. Nancy's mouth was literally hanging open. Uncle Richard looked like he'd been struck. But I wasn't done. I transitioned smoothly into talking about family and success, about how we define achievement and whom we choose to celebrate. I mentioned, without naming names, that I'd recently attended a family gathering where my accomplishments had gone unmentioned while others were praised for far less. I said it had made me reflect on what truly mattered, on surrounding yourself with people who saw your value. Then I announced my first major charitable initiative, a scholarship fund for first-generation entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds, people who didn't have family money or connections to fall back on, people like I'd been. The fund would be substantial, running into 7 figures annually. And it would be named after my late grandmother, my mother's mother, who'd actually been the only family member to believe in me when I'd started out. The reporters ate it up. They asked questions about my journey, about being overlooked, about what drove me. I answered honestly, carefully, keeping it general enough to maintain some privacy, but specific enough that everyone in that room knew exactly what I was talking about. My girlfriend stood off to the side, watching my family's reactions with a small smile. The press conference lasted 45 minutes. Afterward, reporters wanted individual interviews, and I obliged a few. The whole time, my family stayed frozen in their seats at the back of the room. When the last reporter finally left, they stood up as a group and approached. My mother tried to hug me. I stepped back. She asked why I hadn't told them about any of this, her voice breaking. I reminded her that I'd tried to talk about my work for years, but she'd always changed the subject or cut me off to talk about Nancy's latest endeavor. She insisted that wasn't true, that she'd always been interested. I didn't argue. The facts were already established. Uncle Richard wanted to know why I'd felt the need to embarrass the family publicly. I asked him how exactly I'd embarrassed anyone by announcing my own success. He blustered something about airing private matters, about making them look bad. I pointed out that he'd had no problem publicly toasting Nancy while ignoring me just 2 nights ago, so apparently public recognition was only appropriate when it flowed in certain directions. Nancy was crying. She said she'd never meant to overshadow me, that she didn't know I felt this way. I told her that was precisely the problem. She'd never bothered to know. None of them had. They'd been so focused on her conventional success story, the kind they understood, that they'd completely missed what I'd been building. One of my aunts tried to defend them, saying family was supposed to support each other, that I should have told them if I needed more recognition. I asked her when support had become something you had to beg for. Real support, I said, meant paying attention. It meant showing up. It meant asking questions and actually listening to the answers. It meant not waiting until someone had a press conference to suddenly care about their life. The conversation went in circles for another 20 minutes. Various family members tried different approaches: guilt, anger, confusion, wounded pride. I remained calm throughout all of it. I'd said what I needed to say, done what I needed to do. The ball was in their court now. Finally, my mother asked what I wanted from them going forward. I told her I wanted exactly what I'd always wanted: to be seen, to be valued, to have my achievements recognized with even a fraction of the enthusiasm they'd shown for Nancy's far smaller successes. But I also told her I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I'd spent too many years trying to earn their approval, and I was done with that game. They left eventually, one by one or in small groups. Nancy tried to approach me privately before leaving, but I told her I needed space. She asked for how long. I said I'd let her know. By 4 o'clock, it was just me and my girlfriend in the conference room. She asked how I felt. I told her the truth, lighter. For the first time in years, maybe my whole life, I felt like I didn't have to carry the weight of their expectations or lack thereof. I'd proven myself not to them, but to myself, and I'd done it on my terms. We went to dinner that night at the restaurant where we'd had our first date 3 years ago. My phone was exploding with notifications. Text messages from family members. Emails from people I hadn't heard from in years. Friend requests on social media from distant relatives. Even a voicemail from Uncle Richard's wife, apologizing on his behalf and saying he'd been out of line at the reunion. I turned my phone off and focused on my girlfriend. We talked about the future, about what I wanted to do next. She mentioned that the press conference had been brilliant but brutal. I acknowledged that I'd known it would hurt them, but that sometimes people needed to be hurt before they'd pay attention. She asked if I thought they'd actually change. I said I doubted it, but that wasn't really the point anymore. The story hit the local news that evening and the business section of the major paper on Tuesday morning. The headline in the paper was something about a local tech entrepreneur's surprise windfall and immediate philanthropic turn. But the real story, the one that got picked up by a few national business blogs, focused on the angle about overlooked success and family dynamics. One article called it "The Billionaire Nobody Saw Coming," which was hyperbolic since I definitely wasn't a billionaire, but the sentiment was correct. By Tuesday afternoon, I'd received over 100 messages from family members and family friends. Most wanted to congratulate me. Some wanted to explain or apologize. A few tried to pretend nothing had happened and just asked generic questions about the acquisition. I responded to exactly none of them. I'd said everything I needed to say on Monday afternoon. Wednesday brought the first real attempt at reconciliation. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. I almost didn't let her in, but my girlfriend convinced me to hear her out. We sat in my living room, my mother perched on the edge of my couch like she was afraid to get comfortable. She apologized. Not the half-hearted kind, where someone's sorry you feel a certain way, but an actual apology. She said she'd been thinking about everything I'd said, that she'd gone back through years of family gatherings and conversations in her mind, and she could see the pattern I'd described. She'd prioritized Nancy's achievements because they were more visible, more traditional, easier to understand and brag about to her friends. My work had been abstract to her, confusing, and she'd made the mistake of assuming that because I didn't need constant validation, I didn't want any at all. She asked if I could forgive her. I told her forgiveness wasn't a switch I could flip. I explained that I'd spent a decade feeling invisible in my own family, and that wound wouldn't heal because of one conversation. But I also said I appreciated her acknowledgement and that it was a starting point. She asked what she could do to make things right. I told her the same thing I told everyone. Just see me. Pay attention. Ask questions. Treat my successes with the same enthusiasm she'd shown for Nancy's. She promised she would try. Nancy came by on Thursday. Her approach was different from our mother's. She was defensive at first, insisting that she'd never asked to be the favorite, that she hadn't realized how much attention she'd been getting at my expense. But as we talked, her defensiveness cracked. She admitted that some part of her had always known. She'd felt my resentment at family gatherings, seen the way I'd withdraw when she was being praised. She'd just convinced herself it wasn't that serious, that I was successful enough not to care. I asked her if she'd have cared in my position. If our roles had been reversed, would she have been content to be ignored while I was celebrated? She thought about it for a long moment, then shook her head. She said she'd have been furious. We talked for 2 hours. It wasn't a complete repair, not even close, but it was honest. By the end, we'd agreed to try to rebuild our relationship, but slowly and with clear boundaries. She needed to understand that I wasn't the supporting character in her story. I had my own narrative, and it was just as important as hers. Uncle Richard never apologized. I heard through family channels that he thought I'd been petty and attention-seeking, that the press conference had been a manipulative stunt. I was fine with that. Some people would never understand, and I'd made peace with not needing their approval. The scholarship fund launched 6 weeks later with a proper ceremony and more press coverage. My family attended, and for the first time I could remember, they asked me questions about my work. Real questions, not just polite small talk. My mother introduced me to her friends as her son who'd built a successful tech company, with genuine pride in her voice. Nancy brought her husband and actually listened when I explained the technical aspects of what my company had done. It felt strange, this new dynamic. Part of me was still angry, still hurt by the years of being overlooked. But another part of me recognized that change was happening, however slowly. They were trying. Not perfectly, not even consistently, but they were making an effort. My girlfriend asked me a few months later if I regretted the press conference, if I thought there might have been a gentler way to handle things. I told her I'd thought about it a lot, and no, I didn't regret it. Sometimes gentle doesn't work. Sometimes people need to be shocked into awareness. And sometimes you need to be dramatic not for them, but for yourself. To draw a line and say, this is who I am, this is what I've accomplished, and you don't get to ignore it anymore. The acquisition money gave me freedom I'd never had before. I started working on a new project, something more personal and creative. I cut my hours dramatically and spent more time with people who'd always seen my value. I traveled. I invested in myself in ways I'd never been able to before. And I set boundaries with my family. I saw them on my terms, when I wanted to, for as long as I wanted to. If I felt like I was being taken for granted, I said so immediately. If Nancy was being centered in a conversation at my expense, I called it out. Some family members adjusted well to this new version of me. Others didn't, and I let those relationships fade. A year later, I proposed to my girlfriend. We had a small wedding, and I carefully curated the guest list. Some family members made the cut. Others didn't. My mother gave a speech at the reception where she talked about how proud she was of the man I'd become, about my resilience and determination. It was one of the first times I could remember her publicly acknowledging my accomplishments without prompting. Nancy was my sister, and our relationship had evolved into something more honest and balanced. She'd grown her real estate business significantly and had actually asked for my advice on scaling operations. I'd helped her, and she'd been genuinely grateful. We weren't as close as we'd been as kids, but we were building something more authentic. People sometimes asked me if the press conference had been worth it, if the family drama and fallout had justified the momentary satisfaction of revenge. I always told them it wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about visibility. It was about refusing to be invisible in my own life anymore. It was about demanding the recognition I'd earned, not waiting for permission to claim my own success. The truth is, that moment when I stood up and grabbed my keys, when I told them they'd remember this in 24 hours, that was the moment I stopped living for their approval. The press conference was just the manifestation of a decision I'd already made, to value myself even if they wouldn't. And they did remember. Not just that day, but the person I'd become afterward. Someone who wouldn't accept being overlooked. Someone who knew his worth and demanded that others recognize it too. Someone who'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to stop being kind to people who don't see you. I never went to another family reunion where I wasn't fully acknowledged. And on the rare occasions when someone slipped back into old patterns, I had no problem walking out. Because I'd learned that you teach people how to treat you, and I was done being the invisible success story in a family that only celebrated what they could understand. 24 hours had been enough to change everything. Not because I'd destroyed relationships or burned bridges, but because I'd finally stood in the light and refused to step back into the shadows. And that, more than any acquisition or business success, was the achievement I was most proud of.